This is Storytellers and Storysellers live on tape. You're listening to me, Vineet Kanabar, on the IVM Podcast Network. Each episode of this podcast, we bring you people from the world of entertainment, people who are either creating and telling stories or people who are making stories happen. On today's episode, we're talking to someone who I have the good fortune of calling my friend Harshvardhan Tanwar.
Hello.
Harsh, welcome to the show. I'll do a quick introduction. Harsh and Harsh's wife, Isha, run No Footprints. No Footprints is the number one rated on TripAdvisor. The number one rated tour operator, walking tour guide in Bombay.
Experience provider,
travel experience provider,
correct.
Curators. I'll read this out to you, right?
Huh.
At No Footprints, they aim to bring to the fore community-based stories and unknown narratives through tours and experiences that are being lost due to constant urbanization. Since their inception in 2014, No Footprints has curated creative experiences and have over 35 experiences in Bombay and Delhi. They've had the good fortune to take Nigella Lawson, Eric Roth, I think Liz Truss.
Yeah, Liz Truss. Liz Truss, no, but Eric Roth, yes.
Eric Roth, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you've had some amazing people. You've been
Yeah.
featured in some amazing travel
Correct.
brands and media. You're really curating Bombay's history and now Delhi's history as well.
Correct.
Harsh, I want to get you started by having you tell us, how did you start this?
So, firstly, Vinny, thanks for having me. It's amazing to come here and very, very kind introduction. We had the fortune of taking around a few fun people, but as I say, all our guests are fun, right? I think the beauty about doing this job is just meeting people from so many different places, right? And when you do, I think that opens your mind. I think travel is the single, and I think you'll agree with it, right? Is the single unifying force that makes you realize the world is so small, yeah. Right. And for me, personally, I think the journey, I always say that all great stories start with alcohol. Mine started with the lack of it. Right. This was, so it goes back to a time when I was in advertising. We were chosen for the Cannes 30 under 30.
Right.
So at Cannes we were there, and then, we went around Cannes and we were given like some 50 euros a day for 7 days. And you don't realize how expensive South of France is. So eventually those 50 euros went away like in no time. So by the time we reached Paris, I was like, we had no money.
Right.
So clearly our evenings were shorter and without alcohol. So what do? I decided to go take a free walk because, those were one of the things that Europe does is a lot of these very interesting free walks that are run by, these students.
Mm-hmm.
So I went for one of them, and it just, when I was going to Paris, I was like, shared experiences of people came in. You come in with these, a lot of myths in your head about places, more so Paris, right? And then I went to this walk with a Parisian, and she was incredibly funny, man, right? It was like a stand-up piece that we were walking around and seeing history, and suddenly I'm like, dude, this is incredibly fun, right? And you suddenly start looking at a city in a different way entirely.
How old were you when this was?
This was in 2012.
Right.
End. I think 2012 end. 2012 end. And then I came back, and I was always interested in trivia, and sometimes very useless trivia, right? Like I used to read stuff like avocados are berries and brinjals are berries, and and I never knew that these trivia things were so you just generally listen to it, and trivia
You
was
just
fun.
collect
You're just collecting trivia, right?
Yeah.
And this girl was going on saying one trivia after another, and just everyone's having fun, and she's using a bit of humor, and I'm like, this is really fun. And we were anyways in the idea of creating content. It was written content.
Right.
But anyways, that part of it happened. I came back, and maybe it was 2013. I went for a walk in, was it Bombay or was it one of the other cities that we were traveling to? And I was like,
Not the same.
yeah, we were like, okay, there's a lot of, great. I'm never going to say ever that academicians are not, but I just think that sometimes, tours are very different, right? Then if I want to go for a talk, I'll go for a talk, right?
Sure.
When I come on a tour, I think the idea is to create great vacations, right? Because I was there, suddenly my vacation was fantastic, right? So I was like, there's a lot of historic content, but I just think that the presentation wasn't that much fun. And that was something that I went for, and then I came back a little disappointed. And then I remember, again, coming to the fact that the great stories start with alcohol. Mine started with the lack of it. We are going to, I don't know if you remember, there was a place called Privé. So in South Bombay. And we were there was a party at a friend's, and as always for me, you can see me wearing a kurta. Diwali is for me 365 days a year.
Right.
So I was trying to
I
enter.
feel
Yeah, so I was trying to enter Prive in a kurta, and they didn't allow me. And this was like 2 o'clock in the night, and luckily, and my friends were in. They were having a good time, but luckily Ramzan was on.
right.
So मैं गया Ramzan पे walk. I said, it's not there. Right, this is the place that's going to be on. I used to anyways for my friends, we used to just do these food walks randomly because I love fruit trivia and stuff. So I went into this Ramzan walk saying I'll come back at like 2:30, 3 o'clock, and I mean 3:30, 4 o'clock, and like then go with the guys. And it was Sunday. And I remember coming back, and it was Kulaba, and I saw these Koli women
Right.
walking through, and it was my dad who told me that Sassoon Dock is like a beehive of activity, and I'm like, and when I was traveling down, I saw these women. I said, "Chalo, I have some time before these guys exit." And back then, Bombay used to party, right? So I said, "I'll go," and I went to the docks. And Vineet, you wouldn't believe that was a thing I still can't forget, right? When they say, your classes sound like a fish market, jo hota hai, I understood that us din.
Wow.
Because we walked in and there was like nearly 120 tons of fish that was being, and trust me, when you go down and, it's very hard to explain to me in words, but that whole experience of it just going in and following
And
the
this
lady.
was at like some night time.
Yeah, this was about 4:30, like
Oh,
4,
wow,
half
okay.
past 4. And this was Sunday. And,
Right.
you think that people relax on Sunday. God was bloody, for God's sake, relaxing on Sunday, right? But the Koli people aren't, right? And they were just like at it, right? And Sunday on the docks, you just cannot enter. And at one point in time, you enter at 6:30 and you don't know how to navigate the docks, you'll die.
Right.
I mean die, I mean you will physically die, right? Because you might be thrown off the docks, right? So
Don't go to the docks
yeah,
without supervision.
correct, absolutely. Without supervision and with no footprints, definitely go with them. But the idea was we entered the docks and I was just mesmerized, right? Just seeing the amount, and they were just throwing fish. Like बच्चे पकड़ के वहाँ पे फेंक रहे हैं yellowfin tuna, and there's like these massive, right? You're seeing, these sailfish or kingfish being thrown, and I said, this is very interesting.
Right.
And then I was like, how do you decode this madness? Because I'm sure there's always method to this madness.
Right.
And that's when Isha and I were talking, and we were like, hey, listen, we anyways do work within this whole, sphere of, and Isha was that time working for Time Out, and, she was also doing creative work for them. And we were like, we anyways do written content. Why don't we kind of look at doing spoken content,
Sure.
right? We anyways write stuff, and then of course we'll have a bus full of people. We love talking. The only way they're going to throw us out is if they open the bus, stop it and throw it, which is
Right.
very unlikely. So you have a captive audience. So here we are, trying to kind of decode the idea of what Bombay can be doing at 5 a.m. in the morning, right?
Beautiful.
So we started this tour at 5 a.m. in the morning called Mumbai by Dawn, right? And we were, walking down. We tried to find places. We saw this newspaper sorting that was happening in outside VT, and you won't realize, but you see all 7 different type of newspapers being sorted down. There's an entire way how the newspaper industry works, and you wouldn't really care for it.
Right.
But when you start suddenly seeing how industrious Bombay is, it gives you a narrative.
Yeah.
Right? Then we said, hey, how do we make a place like, say, for instance, something as, and for the lack of whatever, as boring as a vegetable market come to life? And we realized, why don't we talk about what is Indian food?
Sure.
Right? Because we were just discussing before this that, everything is that India has got, right, is from all over the world. So we started decoding that. We realized, we entered a random chicken market, and we realized how the broiler's origins comes from bloody America for the chickens of tomorrow that came from, the World War.
Right.
Right? So there were these really interesting, suddenly there was something so interesting that was going on. And then, we started a smelly note. We said we should end it at a fragrant note. We entered the flower market. We realized there were some great stories there, some that we might uncover as the podcast goes on. And then we reached Shivaji Park and we were doing Malakham, which was on top of a rope or on top of a pole.
Right.
And we said, that's morning exercise, man, seen very differently. So we were like, hey, listen, there is something here that can totally, be a tour. And it is not coming at a time where the tourist is generally doing your 9 to 4 and doing your city tours and seeing the gateways of the world. And we said, why don't we introduce this as a experience? And then the question was, who do we give this experience to? Right? If we want to do this. So we took a 6 month off. We said, let's see who our target audience is. Could we do it for locals? But then locals we can only do on the weekend. So we said, okay, fine, let's look at tourists that come in. So we started kind of working that with tourists. And then we went and pitched it to a lot of people. And for the 6 months, I don't think we had any work.
Right.
And that was the anticlimax. We're like, dude, we really think there's something here. And we were quite convinced. But the idea was one person to do it. And that's a story because we got this one person who said, listen, I'm jet lagged, so I don't mind. I'm up. He was a US citizen. And he's like, I don't mind, coming on this tour. Let's do this. I said, listen, this is our first tour. If you don't like this tour, you only pay for the car because that's not something that is mine.
Right.
Right? Rest of the services are free. Yeah. If you like it, right? No, I said if you don't like it, that's free. Right. But if you like it, you only pay for the car because this is our first experiment and you're the first person who's here. We did it. That person came and just gave us one, fantastic review on camera. Beautiful. And that was our only marketing material that we had, other than, of course, all the spots that we had done. So that's what we did. Isha and I were very convinced. And I don't know if you know Dinkar. So Dinkar actually helped us create the video.
Right.
Dinkar Dwivedi. Oh, yeah, what a guy, right? And, we are sitting down and I said, Dinkar, listen, the only thing I can afford to give you right now is beer. Right. You and I can sit down on copious amounts of beer and we can just make this video, which, you can help me shoot. So, and that's how it was, man. And the first tour was created. I remember we went and we showed this video to a few people and, we started getting work. And rest I say, and pun intended, is history because here we are.
Absolutely. For those of you who don't know, Dinkar Dwivedi, guitarist at Bone Broke, podcaster at Geek Fruit,
Correct.
The Nerdatorium, all-round great guy. Shout out to you, DV.
Correct.
Man.
Yeah, great guy.
What a great intro.
Yeah, right? I mean, a great or not. I think it's a great...
it's absolutely fantastic, right? And what I love about it is that just through that introduction, you have converted the mundane underbelly of a city that you often just don't want to check out, right? Like, you go to any listing and look for things to do in Bombay, and nobody's going to say go to Sassoon Dock and check out the fish sorting or VT newspaper sorting in the morning, right? I think there's a storytelling aspect to it which you just beautifully illustrated, which helps you make sense of the city you live in, right? That's what's so beautiful about it. I mean, when I'm traveling, and I love walking tours, I've done your Bori food tour as well, which is just fantastic. We'll talk about that in a second. But every time I'm traveling, Nama and I make sure that we take at least one walking tour, right? Most often it's a graffiti tour because we love street art and it just makes sense. But I've done food tours and I love the fact that walking in a city makes you feel more of a part of that city than anything else, right? I think a lot of people travel and take Ubers to places and I'm always like, no, either walk or take the underground, right? If they have a public transport system, do that because that gives you like you said, the bad smells and the good smells of the city so beautifully. There's no substitute for it. Otherwise, you're just going to be a tourist there, right? You'll still be a tourist. A 3-hour walking tour is not going to make you a local, but at least you lived like a local for those 3 hours, right? What I'm really keen on knowing, and I'm sure you'll tell us this in vivid detail, is there a process to the storytelling that you bring out, right? Because it's not like these nuggets of information that you have or these stories or these backgrounds or these people there's a roster, right? Again, I mean, I know that you started 2012, 2013. We met, I think, 2014, 2015, around that time.
Yeah, I think, possibly.
Shout out to Rahul Sharma, I think.
Correct, a long time.
And I know that the market has completely changed over the last 8-9 years, right? At that time, it was that demand was low, but also supply was low. We didn't have tours curated with the kind of finesse and the depth that you guys have brought. How did you go about doing that, right? Like, what was the process of putting this whole thing together? Did you literally have to go and meet people everywhere, find their stories, reject some stories? I'd love to know how that went. And if you can tell us a few stories out of that, that really, have stuck with you, gave you the conviction to continue what you're doing.
Yeah. So, it's, they say that is there a science to the art?
Right.
And the art of storytelling, is there a science to it? I think, we realize that at the end of the day, what are we doing? We are going to give someone a great time. Right? That was the idea. How do I reach a point where this person says, holy shit, I had a great time? right? Because at the end of the day, I am standing as or anyone, any of our walk leaders, are standing as ambassadors for the city, right? How I show you the city defines the city for you,
Right.
right? In a big way. So for us, the idea was, how does a person look at this and say that, hey, I had a great time? That was our end objective.
Right.
As much as there was learning, because learning will happen, right? Eventually, because your conversations are not going to be, hey, listen, just about me, right? You're going through the city, you're seeing it. So for us also, the idea of writing narrative, and that really helped in advertising, because eventually you're trying to sell, what we realize, sell a great time to a person. So how do you kind of do that with information, right? Which is readily available, which is there. And we realized humor was critical. Right? You had to have a good sense of humor, and you had to have people who could land those jokes, sometimes self-deprecating, sometimes, we also make fun of the countries that people come in, right? But all in good humor, right? So our idea was that, how do we kind of build those narratives in an interesting manner? And we go through a lot of content, right? Whether it's, there's a lot of research, even there's a lot of hard work that goes in and a lot of rejection that goes in. Sometimes every tour makes you learn something.
Right.
Every walk, every experience makes you learn something, and you reject, you look back and say that, okay, fine, this doesn't work. Maybe that needs to change. But one of the things that we always realized was that two things, right? One, as I told you, it needs to be, the end process needs to have fun, but the way to that is that you make your content interesting. So you choose the choices stories. Secondly, if you can make your guests do something, right? Like for instance, in a Malakam, I tell them, try it, right? So imagine there are like these people who could be as young as 13-year-olds to as old as like 60-year-olds who are suddenly doing rope Malakam. They're hanging on this. And a big
White
shout,
people.
yeah, white people.
Man.
Yeah. So they are, doing that. And Mr. Deshpande, who's, one of the, I always say the greatest people that I've met, right, is, he would gladly show them, and they would do that, right? Or the fact that, we would do a workshop which was in Delhi for a perfume making workshop, where they're learning about perfumery, but they're also taking back something with them. So we realized we need to make people do something. I think eventually there's something to learn, right, for them. So we always make that as a very important component of it, right? There's some amount of learning that goes in. Like we're doing something in Worli. So we're doing something in Worli, for instance, where we're doing a Worli walk, and then we're taking discarded nets that could actually be an ecological hazard and turning them into bags that can be taken, made with them, and actually be utility things. So we realized that is a very important component. So one was great time, right? Make your content interesting. And of course, that means that you learn. Sometimes you make mistakes, you learn from them and say, hey, this is getting too long, this is getting too short. What is the sweet spot of time, right? And this is the amount of content that will really work, right? So whether it's for a foreign tourist, how we kind of pivot that content for for a local tourist, all of that is what is, a lot of R&D that goes in. But over time, you kind of keep creating, keep rejecting, keep doing. So, those stories are plentiful, but you also need to know which kind of come into your narrative, because there's just so much going on at one point in time. You're like, let me choose the choices stories, right? So yeah, always.
Love it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. You're a Bombay guy, right?
Born and brought
up, right? I want you to tell us some of the most surprising stories about this city that you've uncovered while you've been putting this together, right? I think for someone who lives here, what a great way to get to know your city better. I'd love to know some stories that have just opened your eyes and made you look at the city differently.
Correct. I think I'll tell you one human story or एक historic story आपको बताता हूँ. Historic story, what really blew my mind actually was that India at one point of time was producing the best warships in the world.
Right.
And it was the Wadia family that came in as foremen into the city around 1735, 1736 and created these massive ships. And they were, ostracized back in the London ports, saying they were blackened. Their ships would come in, they were blackened. So much so that one of the Wadia members wrote a line on the ship on HMS Cornwallis saying this ship was built by a goddamn black fellow in 1800. Right? Because it was just, not allowing them. And we were producing really good ships with Malabar teak, which was lasting 36 years. And the timber or the oak timber that the British were using was lasting 12 years. And one of the stories that I came across was, and now of course it's become, a little more popular than it was earlier when I was researching in 2013, 2014, was HMS Minden. The ship was actually a ship on which the American national anthem was written by Francis Scott Keys.
Wow.
When Baltimore was being, bombed. So he was there, and, the end of the night he woke up to see, despite the bombing, the flag was still, flying, and that gave him, he wrote the ode to Fort McHenry that, eventually became the Star Spangled Banner. So it was a Bombay-made ship, or the fact that, till today, Bombay holds a world record for a yacht that was a sailing ship that went from London to Melbourne in 80 days.
That's
and we
mad.
still hold the world record. So there are some ships that were, and then suddenly you start seeing a city with pride, right? You're like,
Absolutely. You're like,
अपना
bro,
है.
and
Yeah.
अपना है आज से नहीं, अपना है
अपना है
सालों
सालों
से.
से.
right?
Correct. Yeah, Mark Twain used to come here and has spent some time in Bombay and written about the crows of the city. And you see so many of them, but he's written about it. He loved India. So many things. Yeah, I mean, cinematography. The first film that came about was in Bombay. The first time cinema came into this country was Bombay at the Watson's Hotel, and such wonderful stories are there to be decoded within the city. I've also heard people's stories, and I'm talking about a contemporary way, because you meet so many people, right? There's a goddess in Worli called Golfa Devi, and there's Kol Puja that happens across, the Konkan coast. And Kol Puja is basically what they do is there's a talking goddess, and
Sure.
she talks to you.
Sure.
Right, so this goddess is called Golfa Devi. Golfa Devi, there are two pellets, silver pellets. There's vermilion patches. You put the two silver pellets at the same time.
Right.
Then the bhadji or the priest will ask a question.
Right.
And if the first silver pellet to fall is the right ones, which means she's saying yes. And if the first pellet to fall is the left one, which means she's saying no.
Right.
So a lot of Koli fishermen would actually go out to sea asking her permission.
Beautiful.
Right? Of course, over time, her KRA is increased. Now you have wife problem, mistress problems, money problem, everything. So one of the people there, Sashi Tigri, he didn't have a child. And I used to see him, every Saturday we'd see him there at the Golfa Devi. And, he said that the reason I believe in this goddess is I didn't have a child for the longest time. But one day I went and I asked her. And eventually the goddess gave me a baby, and this is only because of her. And I always say faith can move mountains. Here it
Right.
moves boats. In the Koli village, but such stories exist. Yeah, I mean, of faith within the city, and we thrive on this. Whether it's personal stories, historic stories, people's stories, I think that's what really makes this city what it is. And coming back to the point which I wanted to also tell you is that unfortunately, when I talk about storytelling and about Bombay, I always think Bombay never gets its due as a tourist city, right?
Yeah.
Whenever you have a image that goes out of India, you still have the Rajasthani Safa and the mustache and the guy, and we've been talking about the Maharaja for way too long, right?
Or the Taj Mahal.
Or the Taj Mahal, correct. So Bombay never gets its due as a tourist city. But I
Right.
think when you start decoding a city like Bombay, you realize that, hell man, this is a port city. You have
Yeah.
port cities like London. You have port cities like New York. People spend 7 to 8 days there. Right? You have a city like London where you can easily spend about 4 or 5 days there. Yet you come into Bombay and people are like, kya kare? Right? And there's just so much to do, because every single port city in the world has had the greatest accumulation of people coming from all over
Absolutely.
and making the city what
melting
it is. Yeah, and exactly that's what Bombay is. So if you ever want to see people's stories and hear them and see them and experience them, I think Bombay is second to none.
Man,
Right?
I think I learned about a bunch of things living in Bombay, and I'm not from Bombay. I've lived here nearly 11 years now. I'm married to someone who's born and brought up in very proudly Bombay. It is a fascinating city, right? And not just the stories that are told, also the stories that are not told, right? Like, I remember going to the Bhori food walk and finding out that Bombay is the first place to have ice cream in India, or ice in India, right? And I'd love for you to tell us
Correct.
about that one as well.
Correct. Yeah, so it wasn't of course the first city, but it was Calcutta. But the thing is, when ice came in,
Right.
it's very interesting. There was this guy we often talk about, and I say this on my walks, when you're talking about Shark Tank और तुमको लगता है कि एक आदमी है, ये तो कुछ बनेगा, right? इसका जो pitch है ना, it's amazing. I have a feeling this gentleman called Frederick Tudor was that guy.
Right.
उसने बोला कि बॉस all these places like West Indies and all have tropical weather. What is the one thing that's lacking is ice.
Right.
Now this guy is American, sitting in Boston, is going to change Bombay social scene, right? India social scene forever.
Yeah.
राइट तो और बर्फ़ हिमालय से नहीं आती थी क्योंकि उस टाइम बुलक्कात से आने में वो रह जाती थी. तो while the Mughals and the royalty were enjoying it, which is why Royal Faluda, the reason why it's called Royal Faluda was because the royal is not because of the ingredients of the stuff that they put, it's because of the ice. Only few could afford ice. Right? So Frederick Tudor thought that these are, countries which are basically tropical. Why don't I take ice? So what he did was, he would take Boston, he would cut out lakes and he would send nearly about 180 tons of ice. Of course, 60 tons of it would melt, 120 tons of it would come. First city that got it was Kolkata.
Right.
And Kolkata got it where people were just enamored, right? उन्होंने बर्फ life में देखा ही नहीं था. So when they touched it, they were like, how can something so cold burn you? Right? When you are so, just imagine, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they were so enamored by ice, they were asking the people who are coming, does ice grow on trees? Because they just never thought that something like this could exist. And now, I mean, the copious amounts of ice we're consuming every night we go, you don't really realize it. So when it came into Bombay, of course, the first preference got the Vadiyas because it's coming by the docks, and then it would have an ice house. Abhi jo KR Kama, jo Oriental Institute hai, which is opposite Lions Gate, used to actually be an ice house. और उसमें 25 पैसे a pound का बर्फ उधर बिकता था, which was back then a lot of money.
Luxury.
Full
level luxury.
हाँ, and one of the story goes as part of, whether it's folklore or not, but there is actually proof for it, so it's not folklore. Jamshedji Jijibab apparently had a party, which was an ice cream party in Bombay. तो उसने सबको बुलाया, बोला आइसक्रीम खाने को, and I can just imagine, I don't know what that party was, because it was back then in the day, but I imagine his friends to be 50 plus old people having ice cream for the first time. Just imagine, you have 50-year-olds eating ice cream for the first time. Just imagine how euphoric they would have been.
Yeah.
Right? And they ate apparently so much ice cream that the next day in Bombay Samachar, which was a Bombay Samachar, which was a newspaper then, carried a article that said that, there was a big party where a lot of ice cream was consumed and people fell really sick.
Oh, wow.
But I think that, they wouldn't have been happier being sick.
I mean, yeah. Just best form of sickness.
Best form of sickness.
Right? Like, ask any 5-year-old.
Exactly. Here they were just 55-year-olds, I think. But yeah, I mean, mad story, right? Like, and we take ice so much for granted. It's amazing that, these stories exist right in our backyard, and that's what we try and, decode on the walks that we do.
It's wonderful, right? And what I was saying was, it's great that these are the stories that someone like you is putting together, curating for someone like me. But then there's also an entire aspect of Bombay that, like you were saying, gets swept under and maybe reduces Bombay's stature as a tourist destination, right? Like, one of the things that stood out to me as a big surprise, and it was a history lesson in itself, was the wife of Muhammad Ali Jinnah is buried in Bombay.
Correct.
Right? And when a friend of mine who's into a lot of, walks and tours and wants to know Bombay better told me about this, and I researched it, and it just strikes me as weird that we've gotten to such lengths to keep this story away, right? I mean, whether you like it or not, Muhammad Ali Jinnah is a Bombay Gujarati, right? Any other city in the world, any other country in the world that has spawned the father of another nation, sure, it's Pakistan, right? We know that.
Right.
But he's still someone who founded an entire country, right? We would, any other city in the world would celebrate this fact, right? Like, there'd be a monument, there'd be a museum. Why do you think we don't do that? I mean, why is that?
I think politically, India-Pakistan, I think, is a very different ball game, right? When we are talking about it, I think that's never ending. I think there's a lot of, at least what I think at the back end, I genuinely think that history is history, and we should kind of look at it. It could be anything. Like colonial history, you could go into lengths to say that how it kind of impaled us in a way, right? But it is part of our history, right? Like Jinnah is part of our history. And Bombay has borne the brunt of it
Right.
ever since 1995, right? I mean, the change of name of Mumbai to Bombay itself, Bombay to Mumbai itself, or the fact that, the Kala Ghoda statue was replaced to kind of bring it in, which was another statue that was there, or the fact that we are, changing the names of stations. I think a nationalist fervor has existed,
Sure.
within it. And it's no denying the fact that, there is... and there is a agenda towards how we are kind of
Sure.
looking at history, right? And with respect to Jinnah, I think because India-Pakistan partition was so violent
Yeah.
and I think so bloody, I think the entire idea of that is maybe that's the reason why it is. We have a
Possibly,
beautiful Jinnah house that exists in Mumbai. Jinnah was a very important part of the High Court.
Right.
Some folklore say that Jinnah used to play apparently pool at the Watson's Hotel and was a hustler.
Right.
At the Watson's Hotel. So, and I don't know if I can say the story, but Ratanbai Jinnah, she was, as I said, before the Rowlatt Act and was in force, Jinnah was the, standing for the Muslim seat, and it was a singular seat. And it's interesting because, of course, he gave that up because he was very, very close friends with Gandhi, and the Rowlatt Act was what made Gandhi, right? But he decided to let go of that seat. But when he was going for that one Muslim seat, the story goes like, Jinnah and Mr. Chogle were at Asiatic Society. They were walking down the stairs and it was lunchtime. So Rati was called, drove down and got a picnic basket with some sandwiches, and turned out those were apparently ham sandwiches,
Beautiful.
right? And she's like, are you seriously telling me I'm standing for the only Muslim seat and the only thing you're bringing me is ham sandwiches, for God's sake? But yeah, there are stories. It's unfortunate, right, that you need to celebrate history in its way. I think you need to call out history when it's bad.
Absolutely.
You need to, but it is there. It's there for us to see. It is there for us to view, and it's there written, right? It's not something that can be taken away, although we are doing that very, very...
We are. And I mean, when I raise this, I don't mean it just in the controversial sense, right? Like, sure, Jinnah, and I totally get what you're saying. There is a lot of sentiment, a lot of violent history, a lot of raw wounds that are attached to that specific personality. But say there are museums in Bombay, for example, right? The Bhaudaji Lad Museum, for example, which is a treasure, right? I mean, for anybody who's been inside, you know what I'm talking about. For anybody who hasn't been inside, just Google the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, right? It is a wonderful building. But the curation, the effort that the government maybe has put in it, or the authorities or the powers that be seem to put into curating those aspects, seems to be still evolving, right? Which brings me to my next question, right? As you've seen the space grow in the last 10 years, right? As more people have come in asking for this, as more people have become attuned to the history that lies around them, what has been what has been the big takeaway for you, right? Why are people getting into this? Is it just so that they understand or feel more connected to the city they live in, or is there a larger desire from people, from especially locals that I'm talking about?
Before I go into it, I want to tell you a story of the Bhaudaji Lal Museum, and I'm coming to this, right? And why it connects. When you look at culture, culture thrives at a time when you're a little stable, right? As a community, as a culture, right? But and why I'm coming to the Bhaudaji Lad story is because when Bhaudaji Lad was built, it was at a good time, right? The idea of Bhaudaji Lad, when India was really prospering between the 1861 to 1865 time, there was a cotton boom and all of it. And then, of course, that ended, and the Bhaudaji Lad finally came out, I think, in 1872, if I'm not mistaken. But the idea was people were still going to see Bhaudaji Lad Museum. So I said, how the hell do we get people to enter Bhaudaji Lad Museum? And Bhaudaji Lad Museum, I have to remember, is in Rani Bagh, right? This area, which is the zoo. They said,
zoo.
The only way that we can get people to come there is by maybe telling people an interesting way of calling them. So they said, why don't you come to see the House of Wonder in the Garden of Delight?
Beautiful.
Right? And suddenly, right, you had people saying, hey, let me go see the House of Wonder in the Garden of Delight. Right? So I think over time, I think people have understood that the House of Wonder and the Garden of Delight lies in these ways of walks and storytelling and, getting into narratives. And people, desire, in my opinion, I think, you get closer to the city, right? Very, very importantly. Two, I think COVID was a very big thing where people suddenly wanted to explore their own backyard.
Yeah.
So when you suddenly see it, you're like, hey, you know what? I can't go out of the city precinct. I can't go out of the country precinct. Why don't I see my own backyard? So I'm like, suddenly Indian tourism got a boost, right? But I think in a very social context, I think people are getting more attuned towards culture.
Right.
And being more drawn towards it. I think the youth, especially, our generation and probably the generation, below us, are now kind of looking at culture in a very different lens. Cultural conversations have become very, very important, right? Heritage evangelism is becoming important, where people are realizing the value of things which probably earlier we didn't. Right? And I think with that awareness, it's also becoming incredibly, in my opinion, for the lack of better, really cool to be on these spaces for the first time in so many years. I'm now thinking, hey, maybe I'm doing a cool job at the end of it.
Which you are.
Right? So but I mean,
as a
correct.
customer and as a friend, I'll tell you that.
Correct.
Man, you guys are doing something that is much needed, and you're doing it in a way that is super cool, right? Like, of course, there are people who can do it in a very dry way, like you mentioned in your story as well, right? It's a talk. Come and hear me talk about the city, right? Or it's, hey, I'm going to introduce you to something that has always existed here in a way that you never thought it would be, right? And I think it's a super cool job.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's the reason. I think people are just becoming socially, and I also think that people are now also, I think, friendships, and I know I'll come to it, but I you stay with me here. But I think people are now making friends with common interests. Sometimes I've just had people who've come on my walks, right, and they've come on a walk, and suddenly they're on the third walk, and by the time they're going and catching dinner after that, right? So I think people are now making friends out of common interests, not just because of proximity.
Right.
So sometimes you want to have a good time with a friend of yours, or birthday parties are no longer just about being like completely hammered, right, in a place, right? But maybe trying to find value in how you can celebrate your birthday in a better way, or spending a special occasion, where everyone comes together. And I'm seeing a lot of children now coming on the walk. So I think the imbibing this part of it, starting them young, is very interesting. And, I think we've just become more culturally attuned towards it. I think sometimes prosperity helps in a way, where you suddenly, as I told you, prosperity of a city helped you create a museum. I think prosperity within people helps you kind of look at culture in a different manner. So maybe that could be one of the reasons, especially in tier 1 and tier 2 cities, that people are ready. And I think people now, what we call the French way. And what I mean by the French way is that the French would always spend less on stay, which is a more tangible thing, and spend more on less tangible experiences.
Right.
And I think, and I'm seeing a lot of people, at least
that's what it's called.
Yeah.
Now I have a word for how I plan my
correct.
travel. Yeah.
You're traveling the French way, right? And I realized that in a way which was, where they're spending less on maybe a little tangibles, but looking at intangibles. I think India is still a little away from it. I think, when people see, they want to still have a good stay and have good food, and maybe they
want
probably,
service. I think that's also very important.
Correct.
People really want service.
Correct. And tangible, right? मेरा पेट भर रहा है, मेरे को बिस्तर मिल रहा है सोने के लिए. This is still intangible, but that is changing.
Right.
Like a lot of people are maybe saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to cut down and not stay in that like 5-star, 4-star, 3-star hotel, but maybe spend a little bit extra on my experience, right?
Sure.
And I think that's a great sign, because that's what you realize, that people, and social media has really helped. I wouldn't lie. People want content. Contents available.
Reels banana hai?
Yeah, और walks पे बहुत reels बन सकते हैं. Content is king. You can get content from so many places. We get so many people who are Instagram bloggers. We don't even know them till they're uploading a reel, and suddenly we look at our follow count and it's gone up by like 15, 20, and we're like, holy shit, what just happened? Right? But lots of people are now interested. So that's helped, right? People are looking out for interesting things, interesting content to do. I think that has really come to the fore because of the idea of content, consumption increasing, people wanting to know more, right? And people wanting to also be part of that conversation. I think maybe, tourism has come into that picture. I remember there was one ad that I saw which was bizarre, which said that, don't go for heritage walks, come for a curated experience in our store, something like that. And I
What?
said, yeah, it was an ad that said, ditch your curated heritage walk, come for a curated walkthrough in our store.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, that's a great thing, because finally people are saying
Yeah.
that, hey,
You're the enemy now.
I'm the enemy. I'm like, who cared about, walks or experiences.
Man.
The fact that it's on a billboard, which means that people are attuned to it.
Absolutely.
And I think why not? Whether it's Instagram, whether you want to take that photograph at 7 a.m. in front of, the Gateway of India, or learn a story on Bombay, if that helps us go out to the world and at least be able to spread knowledge through it, why not? Yeah, I think
Love
it's
it,
a
man.
wonderful way.
I'm going to take a quick break.
Yeah.
On the other side, we will talk about the most important burning issue, which is Bombay versus Delhi. Go nowhere. This is a fascinating conversation. We'll be right back on Storytellers and Storysellers.
Hello, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcasts Network. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet talks to Meeta Kapoor, director of the JCB Prize for Literature and founder of Syahi. They discuss how one can be a published author or get a job in publishing. On HDFC Investverse, Anupam talks to Postcards from Nowhere host Utsav regarding striking a perfect balance between work, finance and hobbies. On the Musafir Stories, we have a special episode as we unravel the popular Madras Music Season, a citywide celebration of Indian classical performing arts and drama. And on Think Fast, Varun and Suchita talk about the arrest of Elizabeth Holmes, world population crossing 8 billion, and India getting closer to being the most populated country in the world and more. Once again, don't forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcasts.com. We have some exciting stuff for you. Follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you like our shows, spread the word. Tell your friends and don't forget to rate and review them wherever you're listening to them. You'll also find all our shows on youtube.com/IVM Podcasts. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: Bumble, Kotak Privy Program, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thank you for making this possible.
And we're back. We're talking to Harshvardhan and Tanwar from No Footprints. We were talking about Bombay all this while. And as promised, I'm going to ask Harsh about the big debate. The nation wants to know. What's the real difference between folks who come for walks in Bombay and Delhi? And how different is it putting these together? Like, what's the... As a curator, as someone who's, closely observed people milling in and out of these historic cities, what's the difference?
Okay, I'm really missing Isha on this one because she's the one who's, curated Delhi. But I love Delhi.
Right.
I love it. I think for the work that we do, Delhi is amazing because you're walking in a park and there's a ruin, right? As you were discussing about, your cycle ride in Mexico and the fact that you came across ruins, right? Similarly, Delhi is, you're walking around and you don't even know where the ruin has existed. Right. It's amazing. But firstly, to tell you the difference between Delhi and Bombay is Delhi is still a very and there are two different kind of audiences, right? You're talking about inbound or foreign tourists that come in. Statistically, I think it's 1:6. For every one person comes into Bombay, 6 people come into Delhi.
Oh wow,
because,
that much? Huh?
Yeah, because Agra is next door.
Of course.
Right, Jaipur is a 4-hour drive away, and then this becomes the Golden Triangle.
Right.
And for the first time traveler, as I told you, you still have the turban and the hookah and the mustache, so that's what goes around. So
and
that's
the camel.
And the camels, correct. So you still have those 3 nights stay in in a palace hotel,
right?
Which I read was a very funny thing, which said is the royal family's Airbnb.
Yeah, it
right?
is. It really is. They've done it.
Correct.
Right? It's got like you can rent a room out for $160,000 or
Correct,
something. Yeah,
correct.
for a night. It's mad.
Insane, right? So, so people still love that. So, you're still seeing a lot of foreign tourists that come in. But in terms of also, I think Delhi is just because it's a political capital. I think also the interest. और मुझे ऐसे लगता है दिल्ली वालों के पास समय थोड़ा ज़्यादा है, right? बाकायदा 11 बजे, they open their shops, right? easy work. There could be, the beauty about old Delhi sometimes I think is that there's a lot of chaos,
Right.
but there is, among the people, there's a lot of calmness when I see it. Matlab, thode, it's hectic, but I don't know how to explain this to you. But it's Bombay is always hectic. Like
Always,
everyone
yeah.
is walking with a very
Frenetic.
purpose, right? Delhi mein thoda
Chill.
hai. And, when you go for these heritage walks, firstly, even for the local walks, you'd see like if you do like 20 people in Mumbai, you're like, hey man, I've cracked it,
Right.
right? But Delhi, you go in for a walk and there are 65 people on a walk, man, going to see Qutub Minar, right? And it's amazing to be able to see that. So there is of course, there are also monuments that require that much time, that much detailing. You have the Qutub Minar, you have the Red Fort, Tughlaqabad, you have, Firuz Shah Kotla, you have all those, the story of 7 Delhis and the idea of Delhi. So you have a lot more, I think, just culturally, I think, affinity towards it, towards doing these things. Right? Their weekends are spent that way is quite interesting. So you see a lot of affinity towards it, and there are lots of people doing it in an interesting manner, right? So that's the difference between, Delhi and Bombay when it comes to the tourism aspect.
Right.
Culturally, as I told you, I just think that, every city has its own love. I think you see Bombay as an industrial capital of the country, but you see Delhi as the political capital. Sometimes you see they taking stands on things that Bombay, we don't even spend time thinking about it. We moved on, right? It's the capital of dissent, which is very important for any country to move ahead, right? Whether it was JNU, places like this there. So the affinity towards cultural conversations is very high, there, and you see that even within the tourism spectrum. And it is when you're looking at Delhi, for me personally, as I told you, I love it. I think every time I'm exploring the city, there's something new. Isha being from there, having studied there, having done a college there, it really helps because she's taken me around places, and to the food, man.
Oh,
Like,
man.
How do you?
Oh, for sure.
How do you? I mean,
I know-
how do you?
I know food is a sore point for people in Bombay, right? Like, I've had really regular, normal people, really lovely people fly into like a murderous rage when you say Bombay ka khana ganda hai. But it's not Bombay ka khana ganda hai. It's the food in other cities is just next level. Right?
Correct.
Like Delhi, Calcutta, my
correct.
God, Hyderabad.
Correct.
These cities
Correct.
have invested in their food culture very differently, right? I think, of course, food is a byproduct of culture and availability and resources and trade and so many things. But it's interesting.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Harshan. We talked about how you've curated a food tour with body food, and again, it's a wonderful historical context to that. You talked about your Mumbai by Dawn tour. I know there's a Dabba Wala tour that you guys do as well.
We do a Delhi refugee food tour,
You're-
which talks about international refugees that have stayed in Delhi. So their story with the context of UN.
Right.
So while you're talking about the Burmese, you're talking about the Tibetans while they're there, but there's a certain culture that exists there. Somalian, how India has taken to its bosom so many different, countries, and how, the first time people are ever, जो बिछड़ जाते हैं, the first time they find solace is in through food. Right? It's breaking bread is the greatest way of community building. So, the Afghans, we've done a food walk on that, on partition in Delhi, right? Journey of food through pre-partition to modern food. So, yeah.
That's mad. I
Yeah.
mean, that should be in like mandatory history lessons in school.
Yeah.
Right? Like field trips should be made
Yeah.
of stuff like this, right? I mean, but what I wanted to ask you
Yeah.
was, among all the wonderful and deeply researched tours that you've set up, which one's your favorite?
Actually, my favorite is a tour that Isha and Estha came up with, which was called the Queer Day Out.
Right.
It's a tour on the LGBTQI plus community, and I
Right.
think we were, and this tour, the reason why I love it is because it's constant learning.
Right.
I think the idea of gender, sexuality is evolving every day, right? And when Isha and I were discussing, and we were like, hey, we can't appropriate this. We need someone from the community to actually help us curate this. So we knew a few places. We knew the kind of conversation we wanted to have, from the Nalsa judgment to the conversation on 377 to the idea of pride, but marginalization within pride, right? How do the people deal with pride? Is there any, for instance, casteism conversation around, how do the marginalized and the further marginalized people within the marginalized community exist? So it was a very important conversation, and we stood for communities, right? And we've stood for communities, be it the Kolis, Bodis, the Parsis, the East Indians. We've always spoken about them. We said, hey, we need to do something, but the queer community and queer culture is incredible, right? So we got Estepan to come in, and what we were doing when we were researching, we realized that while people were conflating the idea of queer friendly tours to what a queer tour should be. Right. You could be a queer friendly tour, which means that your guide could be queer friendly. Mm-hmm. Your hotels could give you a double room with no question asked. You could, hold your hands and, and that it wouldn't be like, looked upon in a certain way. But you were still showing the same thing. Right. मतलब आप फिर भी वही चीजें दिखा रहे हो. But our idea was that Bombay has queer-friendly places, right? You talk about the idea of cruising. You talk about, the conversation around transgender communities that exist here. You talk about the fact that there is a pop culture of drag artists that you kind of see it, right, within it. We have a pride, but the conversation around pride was very, very important. Right. So we said we need to kind of bring all of that together and create like a tour that talks about the queer nature of what Bombay is, right? And we started off with an Irani cafe, because I think Irani cafes were a great place. They didn't care about who it was. You could sit with anyone. And if someone fancied your eye, you could just go on to the next table and sit and chat with them. Right. The big beams that you see, Victorian beams, were great places for someone to just, take a, quick kiss as they walk past, right? And a lot of people who were working, they were staying in the north side of the city, would come down to the south side. No one knew them. So this was a great place for them to experiment, right? So what we realized was that there is really something very interesting here for us to, come up with and create a narrative around. So we created a tour around it, which, ends with either a zine workshop or a drag workshop that we do with the artists. We take them realize what the contemporary form of it is. Of course, we also give historical context to it, cultural context to it. And as I said, it's, for us, we did a workshop for all our people, right? We had a 2-day workshop for people just to understand, because it's evolving so much, that, we need to be within the mix of it to, understand it, appreciate it, and, really say the right things. So that was very important. Right. And for us, there was no way we were going to appropriate that. So the entire thing was designed by a queer consultant, and we're very, very proud of the place that comes. The only thing we did was logistics and helping a little bit with what we thought and put in our ideas. But, as I said, we're still constantly learning, and it's just such an amazing tour because it keeps evolving. And that's the beauty of product, right? Product keeps evolving, and such a product we're so proud of.
Love it, man. I mean, I love the immersive nature that carries through it, right? Right from how you've conceptualized it by having someone from the community as be part of it, to the actual experience where you're not just taking people around places and showing them, but also giving them that hands-on experience, that immersive experience with the kind of workshops that you're building. I mean, the more I listen to you talk about this, the more I feel like this should be essential for people who come to experience a city, right? And there are so many aspects to the place you live in, right? I mean, I remember, for example, going to LA and going to Stonewall and feeling like, hey man, this feels important, right? And I'm a little sad that I don't know what that area or what that place in Bombay is going to be. And I feel like there's a lot more awareness that needs to be generated about the stuff that's available to experience within these cities, and obviously a lot more word out there for folks like you who are really curating what would be a modern history of the city, right? Like more and more as time goes on. Let me ask you this, right? Now, with the explosion of technology, there is obviously all of this information available for people to check out, to read, etc., etc. How important is the human element of curation here, right? Because, I mean, TripAdvisor will make you a list and give you 50 best places to go to, and someone can just, make a list and, put it on a Google Maps want to go list and just walk around these places, right? Kind of harks back to what you started with as well about the humor in the story. But why is it still important to have someone show you these places as opposed to just use technology and do your own thing?
Yeah, I think the fact is that you and I are doing this podcast itself is like an answer, a note to that fact. And I'll tell you why.
Right.
Because I think, it's sometimes it just goes beyond information. If you want information, as I told you, that it's all available, readily available, right? For me, I think, a lot of people have come in saying, why don't you take your content and make it on an audio, as an audio guide, right? But my point is that at the end of the day, humans are social creatures in such a way. When you're trying to showcase some stuff, I think there are a lot of things that come in, right? It's theater. Right? How do you, until unless it's like, I know radio is theater of the mind and you can maybe still create it. But when there's a monument in front of you and you're trying to create theater, people can have questions. And, I also believe that every tour we learn something.
Right.
Right? Because it's some of the places are anecdotal. Right? Someone would just tell you that, hey, you know what, I spent, like I had the other day a lady that came in and said that my father was in the, he was British, right? He was married here, right? And he was in, there was a church in Malabar Hill and he got married there. And I'm like, this is insane, right? And then she was saying stories about it. And, and on tours when you're walking down, when you're interacting with people, you get to learn so much, and so much of your personality comes into it that when and different tourist walk leaders would have different personalities to add, right? And I think that is the most interesting part about doing it as people, right? Seeing how they react to it, changing your stance on it, learning something from that, they giving you a little anecdote, you making it a little bit of a personal story.
Right.
All of that is not sometimes possible in a technology-based platform, right? And to be able to just be wowed with theatre in front of you with a beautiful backdrop, I think it's a beautiful performance to be able to see, right? Why wouldn't you want to go see a great play with people performing? Then you can maybe, just watch, a movie on it. So, that's I think that's what, it is. I think it's an exchange of ideas, exchange of information is a great way in a tour, man. You just get to learn so much about yourself when you're doing it. You get to learn so much about the other person. It's unbelievable, man.
It reminds me of this walking tour through Bushwick that we did earlier this summer. So Bushwick in Brooklyn is a place with a lot of graffiti. Right, like a lot of street art, different kinds, different styles. Artists from all over the world have come there, like folks from South America, Russian artists, Turkish artists, and of course, local New York artists as well. I did a tour with someone who's like a 55-year-old woman who's worked in street art all her life, knows all the artists, knows their background stories, knows their mothers sometimes, and she had wonderful stories to share, right? Like, and she talked about it, like you said.
Correct.
She shared something that we told her about, something that we'd seen elsewhere, and it became an exchange, right?
Yeah.
And then a few weeks later, another friend of mine asked me, where did you go for this tour? And I told him about Bushwick, and he was like, where in Bushwick? I gave him the address, and he just walked around. We took the same pictures, right? We took the same pictures of the same graffiti, but I'm 100% sure that my experience of having that woman there, taking us through it, was much more, much richer as an experience, right? For example, she was talking about how this is the place. She showed us a piece of graffiti, beautiful piece of graffiti, and she told us behind this door, the piece of graffiti was on a door. Behind this door, the US roller skating women's team is training for the World Cup, and you're like,
you would never know, right?
You would never know, right?
Never known.
You'd still stand in front of that door. You'd still take the picture of the art, but you'd never know stuff like that, right? And which is why I love what you said, right? It is the the human layer, the personality layer,
Correct.
the prism that
Correct.
that a human mind brings to
Correct.
certain places. That's super important.
Correct. And I think, if you're a great storyteller, right, automatically and anecdotes, right, when you're sharing shared experiences, sometimes they're as important. I'll tell you, right, kabhi kya hota hai, you're on a foreign tour with a guest, right, and then they start talking about your journey through the city. Right, and you're having a cup of coffee, and that becomes the most interesting conversation that happens, right? So suddenly you're just not being looked at as a person who's going to show you stuff, but what's your relationship with the city? What's your story, right? So it's as much about people, when you're also doing, walks for locals, as I told you, they tell you nuggets about a place, right? Or, you tell nuggets about the place that maybe is a very personal experience. And personal stories are so personal that it's only possible when a human tells you that, right? And you are only going to come across, those people when you're having a people-to-people interaction, right?
Love it.
Because that's his story.
Absolutely.
And sharing it with you.
Speaking of people-to-people interaction, what's it like running a company with your wife?
Incredible, actually. She's actually, if I had to say that the brain, strategic brain, it's all there. Right. Unfortunately, I become the face of it. So everyone's like, hey, Harshvardhan and stuff like that. But if you actually see the kind of work that we've done strategically, and we come with very different, expertise within this field, and that helps us complement each other. Right. Sometimes I become the showman, showing off, doing the tours and stuff. But all the ideas sometimes that come in from there. And the most, if I could, it's like just take her brain and just clone it. I think, it'd just be the best thing that could possibly, happen to us. But because she's got experience within consultancy, that's kind of helped her, right? But even other than that, she's one of the most creative people that I've met, and her ideas come in. I just also, bring in the idea of logistics, because bus किधर खड़ी करनी है, that's also as important as maybe tour कैसे करना है, right? या यहाँ पर बात करेंगे तो कम आवाज़ आएगी और वहाँ पे बात करेंगे. So that becomes my part of the job, and sometimes all the creative content comes from it. But we work very well together. I think her creative energy, my creative energy really match. Do we bring our work at home? Always. Sometimes work, especially work from home is practically working all the time. But we are trying to kind of have the 7 o'clock it ends sort of a situation.
How's that working out for you?
Very, very badly, right? Because it never ends at 7 o'clock. But it's interesting because we are now going to Delhi, and she's handling Delhi operations, and Delhi so close to her. I am trying to see Delhi through her eyes, and I'm loving absolutely every minute of it. And the kind of stuff that she's, curating is, I'm in awe of her. And I think that's what really, I think that's the word. I think I'm in awe of her work, and I'm in awe of what she's doing. And I think she's got a certain...
Love it. Shout out to you, Isha.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to get brownie
so
points. Yes.
Full of brownie points.
Correct.
This episode.
Correct.
My sort of last question to you. If I ask you to recommend a tour out of all the ones that you do, or maybe not a tour, right? Because you already talked about which one's your favorite. Tell me 3 of the most interesting spots in Bombay or Delhi that people should definitely go check out.
So, I'll tell you one spot that I love where while people do come, for me, I think is very therapeutic. I've been a Worli boy. Right. So, for me, the thing that I discovered about Worli was the last tipping point of that Worli village, which is next to the pier.
Right.
It's the best place to just sit down and unwind. I genuinely think. One is the Worli fort, and as you walk down to the pier, just there's sea nothingness, and, being able to having seen it without the ceiling is what I think is the most beautiful spot I personally saw. I think it's just fantastic, right? So for me, Worli village right at the corner of the pier is the most beautiful thing, because you see Bombay as it was, right? Fishing villages, you have fisher boats that are still coming in, still you have artisanal fishermen fishing. So I think that just brings the poetry of Bombay alive for me, right?
And all of this in the backdrop of of Worli.
Correct.
Which is- which is
itself,
Worli.
and Worli village, right? And you're looking at it, that's a juxtaposition right there.
Absolutely.
You turn around and you suddenly see these
And
like
I think that's
massive
like the
buildings.
best of the Bombay skyline, right?
Correct,
That's
best.
what's on Worli Sea Face.
Yeah,
at this
so
point, right?
so now of course also because it's interesting, like the ceilings there, which is the new Bombay, and then you have these fishing boats that are coming in, which is old
Yeah.
Bombay, and you're seeing the old and the new combined. So that also kind of gives a. So I think that is one of the best spots for me. Another one is actually BNHS, which is the Bombay Natural History Society, has a small little, 30-acre forest.
Right.
So whenever I want to unwind, I love nature, so I go there for walks. It's one of the most beautiful places. If you want to see what Bombay was years and years and years ago, where leopards were roaming freely, you really have to see the BNHS 30-acre spot. I think that's one of the most beautiful spots. And the third one is actually very personal. I studied in St. Mary's. So for me, when I go into St. Anne's Church at St. Mary's is therapeutic because it just takes me back to the fondest time of my life. I think, studying there takes me back to all our times there. So the third one is very personal to me. But if I had to tell people, I think Hasnabad Dargah is one of the most beautiful. It's the mausoleum of the first Aga Khan.
Right.
It's in Baikla, very close to actually where Ratan Bhai Jinnah is buried, which you were talking about earlier. It's what we call the Taj Mahal of Bombay because it just looks stunning. So if people want to go and see it, I think that's another spot because it's, within grime and squalor, beauty just stands out.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, while the area was pristine at one point in time, when you're going there, it just, that monument just stands out.
Beautiful.
So these would be the places that, for me, I think are, of which one is, of course, very personal.
Love it, man. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for sharing.
Thanks,
I think
man.
I was already very convinced about the importance and the need for residents of a city and maybe even folks like me who are migrants to a city to take a very keen interest in what's around you, right? Because what's personal becomes political and what's political is almost always entirely local, right? And no matter what mainstream media tells you, it's not important what gun rights are in the US. What's more important is what zoning laws are
Correct.
probably in Bombay,
Correct.
right? Or what's happening in RA.
Correct.
I'm not to be political about this, but it's fundamentally important for you, or at least the way I see it, for you to have a true, deep, meaningful connection with the place you really live in, right? And be able to represent it, present it, and understand it better to people. And I'm so glad that that Isha and you are doing this so successfully,
Very sweet.
to add, and so creatively, right? It's super fulfilling at the end of a walk, whether it's food or not. It's so fulfilling because you've always come away A, having fun, and B, definitely learning something new that helps you understand the city better, right? From my own experience, again, not just this evening, it's always fun to sit and talk, but I remember the food tour that we went to. It started with historic context of who the bodies were and how they came about here, and the real estate you're standing on was, the sweat and blood of people who've lived here for 30 years. And then it proceeded into karas and mithas and
Correct.
food and all of that,
Correct.
right? So thank you so much for
Cheers,
doing
man.
what you do, man, and for being on the show today. It was a pleasure having you on.
Absolutely, man. It's been my absolute pleasure to do this. And thanks, Vineet, for having me here, man. As I say, I think people should keep walking and, hopefully get to learn your own backyard because there's some great stories and, there are some great storytellers to tell you those stories.
Absolutely, man. For anyone who's interested, please go to nfpexplore.com
Yes.
or follow NFP Explore
Correct.
on Instagram. They have a thriving community. They put out some great content. And check out some of the fantastic walking tours that they're setting up. Go for one, really. You'll not regret it. It's beautiful. Just the set of people that NFP has doing this are all deeply knowledgeable about the city, care very, very deeply about the city, as should you. That's it on this episode of Storytellers and Storysellers. I had a blast. I hope you take a walking tour very, very soon. If you like this episode, do rate it. Tell your friends about it. It helps us get discovered, just like NFP helps discover Bombay. That's it from me, Vineet Kanabar, on this episode of Storytellers and Storysellers. This is me saying goodbye.